Hey there, I'm Jon Rundle. I'm a designer on the Operate mobile team, and I wanted to touch on some of the new UI and style updates that we're seeing as part of iOS 15 that was previewed at WWDC. Many of these updates build on some of the things that we've been seeing over the last couple of versions of iOS. There's also some new exciting UI patterns that I wanted to touch on and give you an example of some of my favorites. Let's start with Inset table groups. This is a style that Apple has started to introduce already in iOS 13 and 14, but we're seeing it become more prevalent within iOS 15. Taking these groups of table cell components and wrapping them in a container that is inset from the edges allows the UI to have more of a roundy, bubbly type of look and feel. We notice this style start to creep in with some of the newer apps like Health and Find My, as you can see here, but they've started to lean into it even more within iOS 15. They've even applied it to the Settings app, so you can see it much more broadly there. This is a very clear indication that Apple intends to fully embrace this style, and seeing as it's something that Android 12 is also previewing, I think we'll see it as a more common trend for mobile apps. Along the lines of inset table groups providing more of a round feel, I've noticed several other places where they're rounding the corners a lot more. The notification center is a good example of this, where notifications are a little bit more rounded and bubbly, and we're even starting to see pill shapes pop up a little bit more than maybe we've seen in the past. The next UI pattern is another trend that we're seeing being fully embraced now by Apple. Bottom sheet components have become very standard mobile patterns over the last couple of years. Bottom sheets can make it easier to access detailed information closer to the bottom of the screen, as well as being used as a pattern that can allow a view to show two different pieces of information together in a layered approach. Maps here is a great example of this type of idea. Now with iOS 15, we finally get a default bottom sheet component that we can use when building our apps. This is something that has had to be done custom in the past, and it's nice now to have an official supported component. Apple has even documented some best practices for them within the component, such as having it default to halfway up the screen, allowing it to be pulled up to full screen and still showing the peak of the previous screen behind it, as well as offering an option when the layer behind doesn't have to be dimmed down. Speaking of reachability and optimizing for larger devices, Safari comes with a major UI change. The URL bar has now been moved down to the bottom. This is an interesting new approach that I think will take many by surprise when they first use it, but I think the more we use it, the more it'll become a new norm. Optimizing for the bottom area of the screen isn't something new, and many others are also experimenting with this new way of moving major interactions to the bottom half of the screen. It's definitely a big leap with Apple applying that logic to something that's been done one way for so long, so it'll be interesting to see how it's perceived. There are some great gesture and interaction aspects to this new Safari experience as well. Lastly, I want to touch on a few other fun UI tidbits that I noticed while going through the new beta preview. We're now seeing an option for nested menus inside of the popover element. This will allow more detail to exist within those popovers without it becoming more overwhelming. There seems to be a new gradient trend that Apple's using in a few different places. They seem to be applying it mostly to the Memoji avatars, but it'll be interesting to see where this pops up in other places as well. I'm also seeing more visual hierarchy coming in with the typography. Some example views like this here, where there's larger sizes and then smaller sizes, just creating more of that visual hierarchy that maybe hasn't existed as much in the past with mobile app design. And lastly, we're seeing some old elements come back. For one, the text selector magnifying effect is coming back with a slightly new UI, hopefully making it easier to select text again. And that controversial selector wheel is also making a comeback after being removed not too long ago, which had many debating around the best way to set time. Well, that about covers the UI updates I wanted to touch on. There's some smaller UI updates here, as well as some larger redesigns. I think it's always great to keep up on these things and see where Apple's going, how they're refining some of these UIs that they've started in previous versions, and how they're adopting some of the mobile trends that we're seeing from other apps. If you saw anything else interesting, if you were watching WWDC or have been poking around iOS 15, let me know. We'd love to have a discussion about it. I think staying on top of these directions and understanding how we can bring them into our app designs will just allow us to keep modernizing and pushing our designs forward.